This is Home to All, an all-inclusive real estate podcast with your host, Nicholas Acosta. Nick sits down with guests to talk about real estate and how it works. Reach him at downtown.expert on Facebook and Instagram, or his website, www.downtown.expert, or call or text him at 407-508-8809. Enjoy the episode.
Good morning, everybody. This is Nicholas Acosta, host of the podcast, Home to All, an all-inclusive real estate podcast. A licensed Florida real estate broker here in Orlando, Florida, with Downtown Expert Realty, LLC. You can reach me at 407-508-8809 or on Facebook and Instagram at downtown.expert. Again, this segment is sponsored by Blanchard Insurance. They are a paid sponsor of today's episode. Today, my guest, as always, Mike Synthetic, President and CEO of Blanchard Insurance. Welcome, Mike. Good to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Nick.
No worries. So things have been crazy. Like everyone out there listening and watching today, we had to take off last week because we had the hurricane situation here in Florida. So let's start with that, Mike. What kind of things did you guys go through at Blanchard Insurance with like claims regarding the hurricane and the weather we had?
Flooding, which is not the norm for us here in Central Florida, but more so along the coast. And Haley, who has been on the podcast before and who lives out in Port Charlotte. I'm not sure if you saw this in our Facebook feed, but she actually her and her boyfriend Antonio, actually, who was on the podcast as well, lived right off one of the canals over there in Port Charlotte. And the water had gotten so high, it was actually cresting the bank and coming into their backyard. And so she was out. If you go on her Facebook page, you'll actually see a video on there that she's out in her backyard with an umbrella getting swept away, kind of like a news reporter on the Weather Channel. But you'll actually see how high the water got. And fortunately, it did not flood their house. But we did have some clients over there in Reddington Shores and some other neighborhoods and communities out there near Clearwater who they did have flooding come into their house. Thankfully, a lot of those homes, the way they're built when they're beachside or out on some of the barrier islands, the first floor is really just for garaging and not really an essential living area. Yeah, there she is. Not really an essential living area, but we did have some clients who had about 8 inches of water on the first floor. So we have a bunch of flood claims open, and we're going to handle those for our clients and get all that taken care of. So like I said, it really wasn't the wind on with Etta. It was a majority of it was flooding that we've seen.
Yeah, I'm looking at that video. It should be playing on you guys' side out there, but that's crazy that story. The funny story about that Port Charlotte, I just went down there with the sellers and we're in Kissimmee. They're purchasing the house in Port Charlotte, kind of like 20 minutes to the Gulf of Mexico, and they actually had an inspection. I think it was this past weekend, and because of the storm, because of that, they were they were without power, so they actually had to go out again this midweek when I drove them down there to go see the property because the power was finally restored to that area that they're in.
Yeah, and it really stresses the importance. I know, I forget what the statistic is, but I think it's still about 40% of Americans, and that includes Floridians, actually choose to go without flood insurance. And now you're looking at a tropical storm. And one of the things that, has always been a big fear for that area is, what if really a true Category 4 or Category 5 hits, that area? I mean, what you're seeing right there is nothing. I mean, that's just from a tropical storm. So you can imagine what a Cat 4 or a Cat 5 would do. So it really stresses the importance of get flood insurance, make sure your homeowner's insurance is written correctly because, unfortunately with climate change, whether you buy into it or not, I mean, it's on the insurance side, we look at risk, and it's really an inevitability that you are going to have to go through that probably, unfortunately, someday.
No, I completely agree. And I was thinking about as you were talking, about down there and the situation with the flood insurance. Yeah, usually in Florida, I've been here my whole life, and I know growing up with storms in the Gulf or anything that does come ashore, the storms that come ashore. Yeah, flooding has never really been an issue in Florida, maybe into the last few years. I'm not trying to push any views on anybody about climate change either.
Yeah.
My dad actually we had a house on Pasadena Beach, 4 blocks to the south of the Don Cesar Resort.
Sure.
And I remember a couple years ago when my father was still alive, we had this one rainstorm, and it was the intercoastal on the one side had come up pretty high. And the main road that you went to, it was like Pasadena Way, which is also Gulf Boulevard. That particular roadway was underwater. But I remember as a kid, because I had lived there since 91, and when we had storms in 91, that boulevard there never flooded until the last few years. So there's definitely some changes going in that, like you said, the inevitability of needing maybe flood insurance. And even I live in downtown Orlando on the 8th floor of a high rise. Granted, I do live across the street from a pretty decent sized lake, Lake Eola, and you never know what's going to happen. And they even talk about water can come in on the different floors, like from the parking lot into the wall, into the doorways.
Absolutely. And people have to remember, especially out there in that Tampa Bay area, really until they passed the Big Waters Act, which I think was like 2012 or 2014. It's actually been a good while when they started reforming, and FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers started going in and remapping. And that was all due to Superstorm Sandy. Because a lot of the communities up there weren't mapped correctly, and they found out, well, hey, it cost $28 billion. And then most recently down in Texas, where they saw flooding that really was in areas that historically didn't show flooding. A lot of these flood maps that the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA developed are outdated. I mean, going all the way back to the late 60s to the early 1970s, especially over in that greater Tampa Bay area. And you also have to take into consideration like places like St. Petersburg, where, now, of course, they're rebuilding and redesigning a lot of the civil infrastructure out there. But you got to remember, a lot of that, it's the infrastructure, the sewer systems and everything, just like they saw in New Orleans after Katrina.
Right.
All that is not up to date with current weather events. And that's what's scary, is kind of like, does our infrastructure, is it like Katrina? It wasn't able to handle a major weather event like that. So that's one thing that's to take into consideration, whether, choosing to self-insure or buy insurance. Yeah, it's all factors, and it is kind of, it's kind of scary.
I just want to bring that up. St. Petersburg, everybody, that's where I was born and raised. And I think I told you that, Mike. But look how close. And that's where I lived for my entire life up until over a year ago. And, probably the plans to eventually buy a condo at one of those fancy condos you guys see in the Skyline picture. That was not there when I was a kid growing up. No. That's only in the last few years that those condos popped up downtown. But you see all the water around there.
Exactly.
We weren't years ago, when I was younger and lived in there like 11 years ago. Let's just, for example, we weren't worried about it flooding. But I think in 2013, there was a hurricane or tropical storm that came directly through us in the middle of the night. And there were significant flood damage, not just the houses, but for the first time in the St. Petersburg area, like due to flooding that would flood your cars out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
that's another thing people don't consider is, the cars. Of course, the flood insurance is covered under the comprehensive coverage on your on your auto insurance policy, so you don't necessarily need to buy a separate flood coverage. But right there, I mean, there's a good picture of boats. We did see not a lot of boats. We didn't really have any claims from boats due to ETA, but that's another consideration when people, and number one, a lot of people go without boat insurance, which I think personally is crazy. But people still do this day and age. And, on the auto insurance too, people, even on an older car will go without comprehensive coverage. And I'm like, well, if you do live next to the ocean and, you're not parking on a 5th floor garage or anything like that, it's just something to take into consideration to carry.
No. Hey there. Sorry, guys. I don't know what happened. I would definitely agree with that. It used to be like the other thing I was thinking about was that it was pretty much Louisiana and Mississippi and the Gulf states to, central United States or Texas. Those were always the stories you heard about hurricanes and flooding. But now lately it's been, Florida has been the new central focus on flooding. And then talking about like Miami, for example. They have all these high rises that eventually they say that those high rises, the foundations would be underwater down the road.
Oh, yeah, and that's a good representation of that was back when we had, I think, what was that, 2016, when Matthew skirted up the Atlantic coast of Florida. And really what we saw was in Daytona, because we had an office in Daytona at the time. And we were in one of those old buildings, the Crest building. And I don't know if some people are familiar with that. They have a Crest building in St. Petersburg. They have one in Daytona and whatnot. Well, this building is almost 100 years old, and it has these half basements, or I think they called it like a dwarf basement, where it's only like 3 to 4 feet. But our office got flooded because of that. And I mean, it wasn't really that they were able to come in and suck the water out and whatnot, but it caused mold problems and a bunch of issues. And a lot of the buildings out there had the same thing. And people don't realize the speedway was actually flooded, and that water came all the way up to the surge, and compounded with the rain for Matthew, came all the way up to I-95. And people don't realize that. And I was like, that's pretty scary. And Matthew wasn't really a big storm either.
Oh no, I remember that storm. And before we get into the next topic, I just brought up, if anyone doesn't know the sort of the history, you may or may not know this, Mike. I don't know if we talked about this before, but history of downtown St. Pete is actually, they do have a Crest building, and we have one here in Orlando. Mm-hmm. I think that was like the nickel and dime store of the day, which is the equivalent to the dollar store today.
Exactly.
And the thing about it but there's also something called the Snell Arcade in downtown Orlando, sorry, downtown St. Pete, and underneath there's probably one of those short basements that you're talking about. And that actually there's also tunnels underneath the city of St. Pete where they used to, like, for instance, like Al Capone used to roam during Prohibition, also to get away from the police probably. But that was a hideout. So there is a lot of underground in St. Pete. So the possibility of flooding in the future with, possibly with climate change, not pushing any views on anybody, and severe weather changes, that if that underground area fills up with water, guess where that water is coming? It's going to come up from the street up into your house or into your car. Exactly. It's going to go up below and then rise to the top of the street. So exactly. Yep. Cool. So Mike. So I just wanted to bring up and this is a good topic about insurance for protecting people like myself. The client I had last night, and this is only when I brought this up today while it's still relevant was yesterday, as I mentioned to you before the show, and some of you may have seen my post on Facebook. I went into a showing last night, and the power was turned off because they were supposed to close, I think today, whoever it was, but the contract fell through for the other buyer that had lost the contract. And so the power was out, so I had used my LED flashlight on my phone while I was at the property. I mean, it was still daylight, but you know how it gets kind of dusk at 5 o'clock now with the weather change, season change. So we can still see pretty well in there. And, I obviously, as you guys know, firearm and a revolver or whatever, I'm not a gun expert. I don't own a gun. But you could, I guess, thankfully, it was a reflective surface, whatever type of weapon it was. But I know it was a firearm because it was in the shape of a firearm. But that the light on my phone reflected back at me, and I saw it. It wasn't straight in front of us, but it was like a rectangular box in the closet in the center of the primary bedroom closet where you could put things in the shelf like clothes or socks or whatever. So at the very, very top, I saw a reflection, and I saw it was a revolver. And thinking, and I did actually, my colleagues and business partners that I work with in my brokerage all said that they said they would have lost it if they saw that. They didn't know how to handle it, but they were telling me that apparently I handled it pretty well in a calm manner. I reached out to the broker, the listing broker of the property, a couple of times by phone and text, and got no response. I didn't say anything about a weapon in the text message because I didn't want to cause any unnecessary alarm if that was not really the case. All I said was, please contact me immediately or something like that. 911 in my own way on a text message because he wasn't answering the phone. And so the thing is that I spoke to some colleagues, and they had recommended there was a vacant property to contact OPD, Orlando Police Department, non-emergency, and I did. I was not in the property at the time because at first I didn't know what to do. This is the first time I've experienced this in my career so far. And they didn't, they said, give me the listing broker's information, and I did. And then I got a call from the listing broker who finally returned the call to me and said to me, did you call the police? And what for? He said, well, he said, what else are you trying to get a hold of me for? I said, well, number one, I don't know if you're aware the power is off. Oh, yeah, I knew the power was going to come off. And then I said, well, you should, I needed to know that. And they're like, well, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you that the power would be turned off. But when I mentioned the weapon, they said there was a firearm there. And they said, so why did you call the police? I said, I checked with my broker colleagues in the business, and they highly recommended that I call a non-emergency because there's a firearm there. One, because we don't know if the weapon was loaded. I didn't touch the weapon. Number two, we don't know where the weapon's from. And number three, she also said, the buyer I'm working with, the client, she's a very sweet lady, but she said, you never know when somebody may be an opportunist to grab that firearm and pull it on you. Sure. Or they handle it because they want to move it out of the way, and then a bullet discharges from the chamber because whoever left it there had a bullet in it and left it in, did not put the safety on the gun. You never know. Or it could have fallen off the shelf. We have a tendency when we look at properties that are vacant, when you're exploring the primary bedroom closet, you want to open these cabinets that they have these fancy closet setups and things like that. And so, what if she reaches for it? What if I reach for it? We don't know. And it discharged or it fell and discharged a bullet. All those scenarios. And the listing broker had mentioned to me, I said, so about this weapon. Well, yeah, I was aware of the firearm. I told them to put it in a safer place. Yeah. And I'm thinking, you mean you didn't tell them to take it out of the house altogether and just left it there? I don't know. I don't know why you called the police, and it was just a disgruntled listing broker in that situation. So when insurance comes into play, we know we have errors and omissions for contracts and things like that. However, my question to you is, what kind of insurance do you carry to protect yourself or protect your clients or protect yourself from the clients that may sue you because they see a firearm on the property?
Well, number one, in that situation, what would come into play would be the premises liability, most likely on the vacant property. And sometimes homeowners and property owners and investors will carry vacant liability insurance or vacant insurance on the property, and sometimes they won't. And the reason behind that is the insurance companies, of course, understand that vacant properties are huge risk when it comes to squatters, vandalism, theft, and you name it, or even water damage because nobody's really watching the property that often. And they understand the contingent liability on it. So, I mean, when you take your average, let's say, rental property insurance where you do have a tenant, I mean, the premiums on those can, range between, let's say right now, probably, let's say $1,500, per year. When you get a vacant property, most insurance companies sometimes charge up to $3,000 to $4,000 per year because they understand the risk involved. Some of those policies do come with liability insurance, and that extends to the property lines as premises liabilities. Some do not, and when they do offer it, a lot of the times it's not a lot of money. And I'm going to say $100,000, which for a wrongful death case is not a lot. Mm-hmm. Some smart investors who do have vacant properties, for example, our clients, we tell them, I'm like, if we're going to insure this, we want you to max out the liability coverage you can have, and then also probably to put some type of umbrella or premises, excess liability up to $1 million. And we see this happen all the time. I mean, unfortunately, we've had some investors down in Miami who've had people murdered on the property, manslaughter cases, you name it. We've seen it over the years. So that would be the first coverage that would most likely come into play, because the landlord ultimately is always responsible for that property no matter what. It always defaults back to that. Then would probably come into play would be the listing agent's insurance. And not only it would be it could fall under the E&O insurance, but it could also follow under, probably more likely, if they had general liability insurance, because E&O is really just, professional mistakes. That's why they call it errors and omissions. And, basically for somebody screwing up doing their job, in layman's terms. And then, your general liability is really for bodily injury. And that, could mean anything from death to a sprained ankle or anything that you can get sued for. And, of course, in Florida, the way tort works down here, if you have a tiny scar on your forehead that's a couple millimeters, that passes the tort threshold, and that's considered permanent scarring. And of course, with this day and age, anybody can really say they're permanently disabled as long as you find the right doctor, and the right attorney to determine so. So
Right.
those two coverages would come into play. And then finally, on the buyer's agent, also their insurance would probably most likely be third in line. And so obviously you carry E&O insurance, but it's
Right.
always good to carry, if you can, carry general liability insurance as well.
Well, speaking of that, now after we have this, every time this is what I love about our partnership with Blanchard Insurance, is I learn about everything new that I have to. New policy that I should probably get, and this is a definite one that I should get, general liability, especially since it's the first time in over 2 years that I walked into a vacant property where a firearm was very apparent, sitting on the shelf up high, but I could see it. There's so many different scenarios that could have gone wrong, and that would just made me more nervous about it. I remained calm through the whole process, which is probably the best thing. That's probably what self-defense, and speaking of which, I'm in the process of trying to find a self-defense class. Anybody out there that's willing to teach realtors, put an event together, of course, socially distanced and safely. That's what I want to teach, especially after this encounter last night with a weapon. I would say that probably a self-defense person, if you're listening, if you want to comment later or now, you'll be proud that I was very calm through the situation, because I had to be. You can't freak out, because when you freak out, or if you get overly, your adrenaline starts pumping too much, or your anxiety goes through the roof, then that's when accidents can happen. And we all know here in insurance how that works, or insurance, we do know how that works, Mike, when people get excited or anxious during a situation.
Absolutely. And then here's another thing to consider is when you look at gun violence, and I'm going to date myself and go back, to, when I was really young, growing up in, born in the late 70s, growing up really in the 80s and the early 90s. In the 80s, I mean, from my perspective, especially stateside, you really didn't see, it was, everything was a PSA where it was, whether watching a cartoon on Saturday morning or whatever, it was, guns are dangerous. Don't play with your parents' guns. They need to be locked in a safe. And from my perspective, you really didn't see, it could have been there and probably more in remote areas, but you really didn't have a gun culture. It wasn't really a sports. Yes, you had your guys go out and hunting and shooting clay pigeons, but, you weren't going on, Facebook and seeing everybody at the gun range, and especially women. You really didn't see a lot of that. And I think we've grown into more of a gun culture where it is, sports shoot, and especially with, the political. And here's the other thing too, with the political environment, with everything that's going on with COVID. They're already seeing the long-term and short-term effects of mental health. So it's compounding with, guns. You have two huge things. And again, I'm not really pro-gun. I'm not anti-gun. I've always sat on the fence. I grew up in a military family. So I'm not personally a gun owner, but I have friends on one side and I have friends on the other. And I always try to go straight down the middle. I really haven't formed, and I have my own opinions, but I just keep that to myself. But we're seeing from the insurance perspective and the risk perspective, insurance has not caught up to the gun culture yet. We're even as of recently with all the police shootings. Now they're talking about, and police officers could never get insurance. Even like life insurance was to get hard, but now they're coming out with products to require the police to carry, liability insurance if there is a wrongful shooting and they are going to court. There's insurance policy there, which would, obviously pay out the victims or, the families of the victims and whatnot. So it just goes to show you that it hasn't caught up. Now, 5-10 years down the road, do I think there's going to be probably an insurance policy to describe situations that you just said specifically? Probably so. I mean, it's kind of like cyber. It's kind of like we had the tech boom as well, and in the late '90s, which is catching. It's 20 years later, and the insurance industry is really trying to catch up with that. It's the same thing with like Uber. It's kind of like, how do we insure this now? Automated driving. How do we insure this now? Since we've had all these advances and everything, the insurance is still catching up. But like I said, I think there will be more specific products down the road that will kind of catch up with the gun culture.
No, I couldn't agree more, and sad that I had to go through this experience, but it also is an eye opener in this business. And obviously, I'm not, as a broker here, what I would recommend to any buyer's agents, selling agents out there, brokers out there, this is not telling you what to do. This is just my advice that once you get a listing, and you've already signed the listing, you go through, and actually, I'll give this credit. This credit is to Rachel Gorman, my business partner in Pinellas, who's also with my company. And she said to me last night on the phone, because I called her for a scenario, what to do for if she's experienced this before. And we worked through this. And basically she told me that when you have the conversation with your seller, you start off obviously telling them, don't leave any jewelry out that somebody could give an opportunity to steal. You don't leave your medication out, whether it's Tylenol or narcotics or whatever it may be, or some kind of prescription drug. Because people, one, can steal it for opportunists, or two, children can get a hold of it and ingest it. So there's a lot of things right there. So what I'm trying to say is basically when you have that conversation about their personal belongings, then I recommend, and what I'm going to do, and I think I've kind of done it, but now I'll add it even more into my listing presentation when we get to that point in the listing presentation and say, hey, I just wanted to ask you. I said, this is up to you to answer this question, but I would prefer that you would be full disclosure with me on this. Do you have a firearm on your property, like whether it's vacant or occupied? Do you have a firearm on the property?
Absolutely.
Is there any kind of safe in here that holds a firearm, or even money too? Because opportunists could try to break in and try to steal the safe. Just because you have a safe doesn't mean that criminal can't find their way into that safe to get your belongings. Especially a weapon, which they could use and then get tied back to you. Also for, the safety factor there. But always ask those questions. And so not necessarily make that the beginning part of the conversation when you start talking about personal belongings like medicine and jewelry. Make that the last thing, like, so you don't start off with a negative thing about having a gun. Maybe just start with the regular stuff in the beginning about the medication and jewelry, procuring it properly. And then I just have to ask you one last question, and then say, hey, I don't mean to intrude, and I'm not trying to push any views on you. I just have to, for the safety of yourselves, as well as myself and potential buyers out there and buyer's agents or whatever the case may be, anybody out there, do you have a firearm on the premises? And if they say yes, they do. The first question, if it's an occupied house, is that item locked securely in a safe? Then you're okay. And if it's in a case where it's a vacant property and they say have a firearm in the premises, I would highly recommend them and say, by the way, I would like to advise that you remove this weapon from the property, especially on a vacant property, even if it's in a safe, because you never know when somebody goes in a room, it takes seconds. And if you're dealing with a professional criminal, they can get that firearm quickly. And then you could be in a situation where you could be at harm, where they can have the weapon pointed at you. Because you never know. People, we're human. Humans are great, but humans, we all can have a tendency to lose it or go through duress or stress, especially with COVID right now. Lost their jobs. They lost their livelihood. So this is a dangerous thing,
Yeah, no, agreed. And when we see theft claims and burglary claims on our clients' properties, I can tell you they can rob a house in 90 seconds to 5 minutes flat. You will not even know it. And the number one things that they go after are, of course, jewelry, gold they can melt down and take to a smelter. It's things that have street value. So firearms, big, medications, and jewelry. Those three things They won't touch anything else. TVs, whatever. Computers nowadays, whatever. They're not stealing DVDs anymore because they're pretty, much useless. So those three things. And people also got to consider that if somebody comes in and steals that firearm and goes out and kills somebody or shoots somebody, uses in a robbery, you can still be held liable for not securing it. So yes, I think it's a very important conversation that I would have. And then the other thing too that I've learned, I think, in my adult life, and especially being in this business, and since we do have a lot of clients who own investment properties, and my advice to them is, number one, you never know who your tenants are. Truly, you never know. They sign the application and whatnot and get in there. We've had clients who had college students, running grow operations, and the DEA kicked down the door and they didn't even know. Right. So it's always, make sure they're insured. Your tenant's number one. And even, my advice for any, brokers and realtors out there, the people that you are showing the house, hopefully they're good people and whatnot. But again, at the end of the day, how truly do we know people, and everything about them? And we've had, and to end on something, we've had a lot of clients who've had birthday parties over, families and friends, and, people from the neighborhood or a graduation party. And our clients wind up getting robbed. The diamond ring goes missing, the engagement ring, the Rolex watch, guns stolen, everything. So it's always kind of like, and you got to think about that. It's unfortunate in this day and age, but it's just something to consider, because like I said, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, and I hate to be, Mr. Joy Kill, but we unfortunately are on the end where, we see sometimes the worst in people. So.
No, I completely agree. And so before we wrap up here in a second, apparently Mike must have got the memo, and I got the memo that we both hit a brick wall this week, because you see our background today, that we picked the same exact background for how appropriate for a Friday before the weekend.
I know I'm very old, very, very uber casual today. I think it was a long week, and
same here. Yeah.
I'm trying to cram everything into this week before the holiday next weekend, because I know it's going to be, people are going to be off, and we're still going to be busy here, and I'm probably going to wind up working, Friday, but I know it's just going to be chaos around here, so I'm just kind of like, I'm going to take a little bit of a breather today before, we jump back into it.
Well, sounds good. And all right, guys. Well, we do appreciate your joining in today, and we had quite a bit of viewers here. Thank you guys for your continued support. And thank you, Mike, again, for this interesting conversation. I'm sad that I had to experience that, but yeah, it made for a good topic at the end of the second half of the show today. And but it's also, I'm glad I experienced it in the way I did. That way I could be able to continue to educate people for their own safety out there, to look for certain signs like we ran into last night.
Hey, we had to end on something. I know I'm laughing here, but I shouldn't really be laughing. But when I first got into the business, we had a cat that the owner had left out, and the listing agent, didn't lock it up or anything. And the buyers basically walked in the door and had a little child that was probably about 3 years old, just taking his first steps and whatnot. And the cat leaped off a bookshelf or something like that, scratched the kid's eyeball out. And it wound up being probably, I think it was like a $500,000 surgery, and the kid was permanently blinded, disabled, and whatnot. And well, guess what? They didn't sell the house after that, because the owner of the house got sued for everything they had. And it's something, like I said, I would never think about. And now I kind of, like, if I was a realtor, I'd be like, don't worry about locking up your dogs. Lock up your cats as well, because freak accidents can happen.
Yep, you never know. That's all. All right, Mike. Well, thank you, and I'll see you then again on Tuesday morning. And
absolutely.
And you guys, you have a great week, everybody. And thank you, Mike, for being on here. This has been Home to All, an all-inclusive real estate podcast, brought to you by Blanchard Insurance, with Mike Sensetic, the president and CEO of Blanchard Insurance. A great chat as always. We will be back again Tuesday. I will give you an update on another show, because I always keep forgetting that next Friday is my birthday, and then also Thursday's Thanksgiving. We may tweak our schedule a little bit. Maybe we'll do one and then make up the other two the other one next week. Because I forget, in this business, we forget when the holidays come. So it's all good. I keep being, I don't know. I know I'm only turning 40 next Friday. But
that's a big one. You got to celebrate.
Yes, but I'm still good with it. So, it's been so crazy busy with everything that I keep forgetting it's a holiday next week. Although they have been putting holiday decorations in the store since like August, so that's probably why I'm confused. But all right. So this has been Home to All Inclusive Real Estate Podcast. I'm Nicholas Acosta, your host and producer of the show. Also a licensed Florida real estate broker with Downtown Expert Realty LLC. Visit me at www.downtown.expert, 407-508-8809, or at downtown.expert on Facebook and Instagram. You can also check me out on LinkedIn at downtown.expert as well. Thanks again to our sponsor, Blanchard Insurance, and thanks for listening. So, Mike, I'll see you next week, and have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks, everybody.
You're welcome. Have a good day, guys. Take care.
This has been Home to All, an all-inclusive real estate podcast. Find Nick on Facebook and Instagram at downtown.expert, and also his website, www.downtown.expert, or call or text him at 407-508-8809. Thanks for listening.
Instead of spending hours or even days looking for your new home, let a Downtown Central Florida expert guide you. Hi, I'm Nicholas Acosta, and I'm here to welcome you home. Being a Florida native, I know how exciting, convenient, and stylish the downtown Florida lifestyle is. Whether you're entertaining your guests or enjoying the views, Central Florida downtown has a lot to offer you and your family. Buying, selling, or investing, I'm your Downtown Central Florida expert.